She doesn't belong here. I've been watching her for almost an hour now, and something's not right. The words crackle through the 911 dispatch recording with the particular compression of emergency calls, distant yet undeniably real. A female voice, educated, practiced in the art of concerned citizenship. The kind of voice that expects to be believed without question. Can you describe what she's doing that concerns you, ma'am? She's just sitting there, on a bench near the playground. Black woman, maybe late 30s, early 40s, dark hoodie, jeans. She's got a book, but she keeps looking around, writing things down sometimes. It's unsettling for the families. Has she approached anyone? Made any threats? A pause. The sound of birds chirping in the background, children laughing somewhere distant. Saturday morning sounds, peaceful and ordinary. No, but you know how it is. She doesn't look like she lives around here. I have a feeling. Can't you just send someone to check? The dispatcher's voice remains neutral, professional. We'll send a unit to assess the situation. Can I get your name for our records? I'd rather not. I'm just a concerned mother. That's all you need to know. The call ends at 8 minutes and 47 seconds past 9 in the morning, lasting 94 seconds. Enough time to redirect a patrol unit from its regular route. Enough syllables to transform a woman reading alone on a park bench into a suspicious person requiring police intervention. 3 blocks away, the woman in question turns a page of her paperback novel without looking up. She heard the cruiser's engine before she saw it, felt the shift in the park's atmosphere as Saturday morning joggers glanced toward the parking lot, registered the particular crunch of tires on gravel that meant authority had arrived. Her coffee has gone lukewarm in its reusable cup. Her reading glasses sit slightly crooked on her nose. She does not adjust them. The cruiser's door opens with a metallic groan that carries across the manicured grass. Boot heels strike pavement, then softer ground. The footsteps approach with the measured cadence of someone who expects compliance before a single word is spoken. She marks her page with a receipt from a hardware store, closes the book, and waits. The morning sun catches the worn lettering on her Howard University hoodie, faded from years of washing, comfortable in the way that only old clothes can be. Her hands rest open on her thighs, palms facing upward, fingers relaxed. A posture learned in circumstances far more dangerous than a public park on a spring morning. The officer's shadow falls across the bench first, blocking the warmth she had been enjoying. She counts 2 heartbeats before looking up, meeting eyes that have already decided what kind of encounter this will be. The cruiser's tires had whispered against the asphalt 3 minutes earlier. She had not looked up then either. She had been expecting them for weeks. Chapter 3 Saturdays ago, Nadine Holloway had discovered this bench during what her staff called her observation walks and what she privately considered her sanity checks. The small municipal park occupied 2 acres in a neighborhood that had gentrified faster than city services could keep pace, where Victorian homes now sold for 7 figures and the farmer's market charged $18 for artisanal bread. It was the kind of place where everyone smiled and no one made eye contact for too long, where diversity was celebrated in lawn signs but questioned in practice. She had come that first Saturday in running clothes, hair pulled back, no makeup, no security detail, no identifying markers of the position she had held for exactly 11 weeks. The election had been close, contentious, decided by 4,000 votes out of nearly 200,000 cast. Her campaign promise of police accountability reform had energized some voters and terrified others. The police union had endorsed her opponent. Yard signs had been stolen, replaced, stolen again. Someone had spray-painted a slur on her campaign headquarters 2 weeks before Election Day. She had won anyway. But winning an election and governing a city were different skills, and Nadine had learned early in her career that the truest measure of any system was how it treated people when no one important was watching. So she had started walking. Through different neighborhoods on different days, at different times, wearing different clothes. Observing, listening, watching her city reveal itself in the small moments between official appearances. This park had caught her attention because of how quickly the atmosphere changed when she sat down. The first Saturday, a security guard had circled her bench 4 times in 30 minutes before asking if she needed help finding anything. The second Saturday, a woman with a stroller had changed her walking path to avoid passing within 10 feet of Nadine's position. This third Saturday, she had settled in at 8:45 in the morning with a novel she had been meaning to finish for months, and a determination to document whatever happened next. Her phone lay face down on the bench beside her, its voice recording application activated the moment she had seen the security guard's second pass. Old habits, the kind that came from years of navigating spaces that questioned her presence before she had spoken a word, the kind that had served her well in courtrooms and boardrooms and city council chambers, where her competence was perpetually on trial regardless of her credentials. She arranged her belongings with unconscious precision, the coffee cup 3 inches from the bench's edge, the book parallel to the wooden slats, her keys in her left jacket pocket where she could reach them without fumbling. Habits from a life that required knowing where everything was at all times. Her staff would have recognized the pattern. Her opponents would have called it paranoid. She called it prepared. The morning progressed in the particular rhythm of suburban Saturdays. Joggers passed in expensive athletic wear, earbuds creating bubbles of isolation. Dog walkers congregated near the water fountain, their conversations drifting across the grass in fragments of weekend plans and neighborhood gossip. Children shrieked on the playground equipment, their voices carrying the uncomplicated joy that only arrives before the world starts teaching different lessons. Nadine read, or appeared to read. Her eyes moved across the pages, while her peripheral vision tracked the park's human ecosystem, noting who moved freely and who moved carefully, who received smiles and who received second glances. A young black man in a delivery uniform crossed the park at 9:12, walking the paved path that curved toward the parking lot. 3 separate women clutched their purses tighter as he passed. He noticed. His shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, his pace quickened, his head angled down. The familiar arithmetic of threat calculation, performed so automatically it probably no longer registered as conscious thought. The security guard appeared again at 9:21. Different route this time, approaching from the west instead of the south, but his destination was obvious. He slowed as he neared her bench, his gaze lingering on her face, her clothes, her coffee cup, her book. Categorizing, assessing, deciding whether she required intervention. Nadine met his eyes and smiled. Not warmly, not coldly. Just the polite acknowledgement of one human being registering another's presence. The guard hesitated, then continued past without speaking. Whatever threshold he had been approaching, the direct eye contact had disrupted his momentum. A small victory, the kind that exhausted her more than any council meeting ever could. At 9:27, a woman in yoga pants and designer sunglasses began watching from near the playground. She stood apart from the other parents, phone in hand, attention divided between her daughter on the swings and the woman on the bench who had been there too long. Nadine recognized the posture, the calculation, the growing conviction that something needed to be done about the situation she was observing. The woman made her call at 9:31, walking toward the parking lot for privacy, but not far enough to be out of sight. Nadine could see her mouth moving, her free hand gesturing, her body language shifting between concern and righteousness. The performance of civic duty, the certainty that her discomfort constituted evidence of wrongdoing. Nadine turned a page she had not read. The coffee had gone cold. The morning had gone exactly as she had expected. The officer who approached her bench was younger than she had anticipated, early 30s perhaps, with the build of someone who had played sports in high school and maintained the habit without the same enthusiasm. His hand rested near his belt in a posture that was probably taught as casual vigilance, but read as implicit threat. His badge caught the morning light. His nameplate identified him as M. Gentry. "Morning, ma'am." His voice carried the particular friendliness that could shift to command without warning. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Nadine closed her book slowly, marking her page with the hardware store receipt. She did not stand, did not reach for her belongings, did not do anything that could be interpreted as sudden movement. Her hands remained visible, resting on her thighs, positioned exactly where they had been when she had first heard his approaching footsteps. "Good morning, officer. I'm reading." She held up the paperback as evidence, its cover slightly worn from being carried in various bags over the past month. "Is there a problem?" Officer Gentry's eyes moved across her face, her clothes, the items on the bench beside her. The same categorization the security guard had performed, but with different stakes. His weight shifted slightly forward, creating the subtle pressure of authority that relied on physicality to communicate what words left unsaid. "We got a call. Someone concerned about suspicious activity in the area." "Suspicious activity?" She repeated the words without inflection, letting them sit in the air between them. "Such as?" "That's what I'm here to determine, ma'am. Can I see some identification?" The request hung in the morning air, polite in phrasing, but not in implication. Nadine considered her options with the rapid calculation that had become second nature over years of similar encounters. Compliance would end this quickly, but would validate the premise that her presence required explanation. Resistance would escalate the situation, but would establish a record of what she suspected was happening. Her voice remained level, carrying the flat precision of someone accustomed to controlling rooms. "Officer, am I being detained?" Gentry's expression flickered, a micro-shift that suggested the question was not one he heard often. Most people in her position simply produced their identification and hoped for the best. Most people had learned that cooperation was the safest path, regardless of whether cooperation was legally required. "I'm asking nicely. Let's not make this difficult." "I'm not trying to make anything difficult. I'm trying to understand the legal basis for your request." She kept her tone conversational, almost curious, the way she might inquire about a point of procedure during a city council meeting. "Under Georgia law, specifically OCGA Section 16-11-36, you need reasonable articulable suspicion that I've committed or am about to commit a crime before you can lawfully detain me for identification purposes. Reading a book on a public bench doesn't meet that threshold." The statute citation landed with visible impact. Gentry's jaw tightened. His weight shifted again, this time backward, a retreat masked as reassessment. People who quoted legal codes were usually attorneys, activists, or troublemakers, sometimes all three. The encounter was not following the expected script. "Ma'am, I'm not detaining you. I'm just asking some questions. Someone was concerned about your presence here." "Someone was concerned that I was sitting quietly and reading. That's not criminal activity. That's Saturday morning." "Look, I don't make the rules about who calls in complaints. I just respond to them. Now, we can handle this the easy way, where you show me some ID and we all go about our day. Or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Nadine noted the implicit threat, filed it away in the mental catalog she had been building since the cruiser first appeared. Her phone continued recording, capturing every word, every pause, every shift in tone. Documentation was protection. Evidence was armor. She had learned these lessons in arenas where the stakes were higher than a park bench conversation, and she had no intention of forgetting them now. "Officer Gentry?" She used his name deliberately, acknowledging his authority while asserting her own awareness. "I'm happy to have a conversation with you. I have nothing to hide, and I'm not trying to be difficult, but I'd like to understand what specific suspicious activity has been reported before I decide how to respond to your request." Before he could answer, a second patrol car pulled into the parking lot. The cavalry arriving, though Nadine suspected the original officer had not yet called for backup. Someone else had. Someone who was monitoring the situation. Someone who had decided additional authority was required. The second officer was older, female, with sergeant stripes on her uniform and the weathered confidence of someone who had supervised countless street encounters. Her nameplate read, P. Whitfield. She approached with the measured stride of command, taking in the scene with quick, practiced assessment. "What have we got?" Her question was directed at Gentry, but her eyes stayed on Nadine. "Suspicious person call. Subjects being uncooperative. Won't show ID." The word landed like a designation, a category into which Nadine was now officially placed. Uncooperative. The label that justified escalation, that transformed reasonable questions into resistance, that converted citizens into problems requiring solutions. Sergeant Whitfield approached the bench directly, positioning herself at an angle that allowed her to observe both Nadine and the surrounding area. Her hand rested on her belt in the same pose her subordinate had adopted, the universal posture of authority preparing for contingencies. "Ma'am, my officer asked you a simple question. You can answer it here, or we can continue this conversation at the station. Up to you." The threat was explicit now, wrapped in the language of choice but offering no real options, compliance or consequences, cooperation or escalation. The binary that defined too many of these encounters, that left no room for dignity or due process, or the simple recognition that some questions should not need answering. Nadine's phone lay on the bench beside her, face down, recording light blinking beneath the case. The woman in yoga pants had returned from the parking lot and was watching from near the playground, her expression caught between satisfaction and uncertainty. The joggers and dog walkers had begun to drift away, sensing the shift in atmosphere that preceded something worth avoiding. "Sergeant, I've explained to Officer Gentry that reading on a public bench doesn't constitute suspicious activity under Georgia law. I've asked what specific behavior has been reported that would justify a detention. Neither of those questions has been answered." Whitfield's eyes narrowed slightly. "You a lawyer? Does my profession affect my constitutional rights?" "It affects my patients." The sergeant stepped closer, reducing the distance between them to something that felt like pressure. "Here's what I know. I got an officer who responded to a legitimate call. I got a subject who's refusing to cooperate with a simple request. And I got about 30 seconds before I decide this situation requires further investigation. You want to keep playing games, or you want to show some ID so we can all move on with our morning? If you're already sensing where this is headed, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will change everything you think you know about this situation." Nadine considered the calculus one final time. She had the legal right to refuse. She had the evidence of their approach already recording. She had the knowledge of what their badges meant and what her own position could eventually mean once this encounter reached its inevitable conclusion. But she also had a responsibility to see this through, to document not just the words, but the escalation, to understand how her city's officers treated citizens who committed no crime except existing in spaces where they were not expected. Her phone buzzed once, a notification she could not see but could feel through the bench's wooden slats. The recording continued. The morning continued. The confrontation continued toward whatever destination it had been moving toward since the first complaint was called in. "I'd like to know what I'm suspected of doing," she said quietly. "That's not a game. That's due process." Whitfield's radio crackled with a burst of static, a dispatcher's voice announcing something about a traffic situation 3 blocks away. She ignored it, her attention fixed on the woman who had declined to make this easy. "You're suspected of being somewhere you shouldn't be. That's enough for me." The statement was not legal, it was not defensible, it was simply true in the way that certain things were true in certain places when certain people encountered certain authorities. Nadine absorbed it, filed it, added it to the record she was building word by word. And then she heard the third engine, the one that did not belong to a patrol car, the one that announced the arrival of someone whose presence would complicate everything that followed. Chato. The woman in yoga pants approached the cluster of officers and civilian with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being welcomed into conversations she had not been invited to join. Her daughter remained on the swings, watched by another parent who had agreed to supervise with a quick nod and understanding glance. These arrangements happened easily among people who recognized each other, who shared certain assumptions about belonging and responsibility and the proper ordering of public spaces. "Officers, thank you so much for responding." Her voice carried across the remaining distance before she had fully arrived, announcing her presence and her purpose simultaneously. "I'm the one who called. Diana Vance. I live just on Maple, the blue Victorian with the wraparound porch. I serve on the Neighborhood Watch Committee." Whitfield acknowledged her with a nod but did not encourage further involvement. "Ma'am, we're handling the situation. You can return to your morning." Of course. I just wanted to make sure you understood my concerns." Diana positioned herself beside the officers, creating a visual alignment that placed her on the side of authority rather than under its scrutiny. "She's been sitting there for over an hour. It's unsettling for the families. You know how it is." "Ma'am," Nadine's voice cut through the manufactured solidarity. "Have I spoken to you this morning? Approached your children? Done anything that would warrant your concern?" Diana's expression shifted, surprise mingling with indignation at being addressed directly by the subject of her complaint. "I don't have to explain myself to you. I saw something concerning, and I reported it. That's called being a responsible citizen." "What specifically did you see that concerned you? My book? My coffee? The bench I've been sitting on, which is public property maintained by taxpayer dollars?" "It's not what you've done." Diana's voice tightened, frustration bleeding through the veneer of civic concern. You know what I mean." The words hung in the morning air, honest in their incoherence, revealing in their implications. "It's not what you've done. It's what you are. It's where you are. It's the combination of factors that added up to a phone call and police response, and the particular attention that some people receive in spaces where their presence disrupts unspoken expectations." Nadine filed the statement away, mentally timestamping it for later use. The recording would capture it, the documentation would preserve it, and when the time came, it would speak for itself with clarity that required no interpretation. Officer Gentry had stepped back slightly during the exchange, his expression suggesting discomfort with where the conversation was heading. Sergeant Whitfield showed no such hesitation, her attention moving between Diana and Nadine with the practiced assessment of someone determining which party required management. "Mrs. Vance, we appreciate your report. We're handling it from here. Please return to your daughter." "Of course. I just wanted you to know that the neighborhood supports you. We appreciate what you do." Diana retreated toward the playground, her civic duty discharged, her satisfaction evident in the set of her shoulders and the glances she cast back toward the scene she had initiated. Whitfield turned her full attention back to Nadine. "You seem to have a gift for making friends." "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to read and drink coffee and enjoy a Saturday morning in a public park. The same thing everyone else here is doing. Everyone else here isn't getting complaints called in about them." "You're right, and we both know why." The statement was direct in a way that made Whitfield pause. Accusations of racial profiling were serious, career-affecting, the kind of thing that generated paperwork and investigations and uncomfortable questions from supervisors. Most people in Nadine's position would not have made such an implication explicit. Most people would have understood the additional risks that came with naming what everyone could see. But Nadine was not most people, and she had decided weeks ago that the risks of silence exceeded the risks of speech. "I'd be careful about making accusations you can't prove." Whitfield's voice had dropped, becoming something closer to warning than conversation. "That's the kind of thing that gets people in trouble. I'm not making accusations. I'm observing patterns. A white woman calls 911 because a black woman is reading in a park. 2 officers respond to a call that doesn't describe any criminal activity. I'm asked for identification without being told what I'm suspected of doing. These are facts. What conclusions you draw from them is your business." The radio crackled again. A different voice this time, male, asking for Sergeant Whitfield's location. She keyed her mic without taking her eyes off Nadine. "Riverside Park. Situation under control." Under control. Another category, another classification, another way of describing an encounter that had not yet resolved into anything definite. Nadine wondered what out of control would look like in this context, what line she would need to cross before the situation shifted from inconvenience to incident. A third vehicle pulled into the parking lot. Not a patrol car this time. An unmarked sedan with a police union decal on the rear bumper and tinted windows that reflected the morning sun. The door opened, and a man emerged in civilian clothes, khakis and a polo shirt, carrying himself with the particular authority of someone who operated adjacent to official power rather than within it. He approached the scene with the confidence of someone who expected to be welcomed, nodding to Whitfield and Gentry with familiar ease. His attention settled on Nadine with an intensity that suggested he had been briefed on the situation before arriving, that his presence was not coincidental, but calculated. "Sergeant, what's the situation?" "Suspicious person call. Subject's been uncooperative about providing identification. We're working through it. Mind if I try?" He did not wait for permission, stepping forward to position himself between Nadine and the officers, creating a configuration that suggested mediation rather than confrontation. His nameplate identified him as K. Brennan, but his bearing identified him as something more than a standard Union representative. "Ma'am, I'm Kyle Brennan. I'm with the Fraternal Order of Police, here as an observer. I'm not a police officer, so I can't make you do anything. I'm just hoping to help resolve this peacefully." "Resolve what exactly?" Nadine's voice remained level, but her wariness had sharpened. Union involvement meant institutional attention. Institutional attention meant the encounter had been flagged as significant. Significant encounters required careful navigation. "I still haven't been told what I'm suspected of doing." Brennan's smile was practiced, the kind that was supposed to put people at ease, but instead communicated calculation. "Look, I understand you feel you're being treated unfairly. Maybe you are. But the reality is, we've got officers responding to a legitimate complaint, doing their jobs, and a situation that doesn't need to escalate. Cooperation goes a long way in circumstances like this. Show them your ID, answer a few questions, and everyone moves on. Resistance has consequences." The last sentence was delivered with the same pleasant tone as the rest, but its meaning was unmistakable. A warning wrapped in advice. A threat dressed as guidance. The Union representative was not here to help resolve anything. He was here to ensure that whatever happened next could be framed appropriately, that the officers would have institutional backing, that the narrative would favor authority regardless of how the encounter actually unfolded. Nadine noted his position, his tone, his carefully chosen words. Another piece of documentation, another layer of evidence, another voice that would eventually need to explain itself when the full picture emerged. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate your concern for peaceful resolution, but I've asked repeatedly for someone to explain what law I've allegedly broken or what specific suspicious behavior has been reported. No one has answered that question. Until they do, I'm not sure what exactly I'm supposed to cooperate with." Brennan's smile thinned but did not disappear. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I'm exercising my constitutional rights. If that makes things difficult, the problem isn't with me." Whitfield stepped forward, reasserting her command of the scene. "That's enough. Ma'am, you're being detained for investigation of disorderly conduct. Please stand up and keep your hands where I can see them." The escalation had arrived, subtle but definitive. Detained. The legal threshold that changed the nature of the encounter, that activated constitutional protections, that also activated the authority of police to exercise control over a citizen's movement. Nadine had been expecting it since the second patrol car arrived. Now that it was here, she had decisions to make. Disorderly conduct. She repeated the classification without moving from the bench. Under Georgia law, OCGA, Section 16-11-39, that requires violent or tumultuous behavior, fighting words, or unreasonable noise. I've been sitting quietly reading a book. Which of those elements are you alleging? Gentry's face had gone red, frustration overwhelming his professional demeanor. "Ma'am, when a police officer tells you to stand up, you stand up. This isn't a courtroom." "You're right, it's a public park. And I'm a citizen who hasn't broken any laws. The fact that someone called you doesn't create probable cause for detention. The fact that I'm asking questions doesn't constitute disorderly conduct. If you want to detain me, you need to articulate what crime you believe I've committed." This tension is about to explode in ways no one expected. Make sure to hit that like button if you want to see what happens when they realize who they're actually dealing with. Whitfield's hand moved to her radio. Her voice remained controlled, but the edge beneath it had sharpened. "This is your final warning. Stand up now, or I will charge you with obstruction under OCGA, Section 16-10-24. Obstruction requires physical interference with an officer's duties or a threat to that officer. Asking questions and remaining seated is neither of those things." Nadine's voice stayed calm, almost academic, the tone of someone explaining rather than arguing. "You're creating charges out of thin air because I won't comply with unlawful orders. Every word of this conversation is being recorded by at least a dozen cell phones." She gestured minimally toward the gathering crowd, the Saturday morning park visitors who had stopped their activities to witness what was unfolding. Phones were raised, cameras were recording. The modern democratic check on authority, imperfect but present, documenting what might otherwise become a matter of disputed recollection. Brennan leaned toward Whitfield, his voice lowered but not quite low enough to escape the ambient recordings. "This is getting out of hand. We should consider backing off, circling back with more information." "I don't back off from situations because someone quotes legal codes at me." Whitfield's response was clipped, defensive, the reaction of someone whose authority had been challenged in front of witnesses. "She wants to play attorney. We'll see how well that works for her." She stepped toward the bench, closing the remaining distance until she stood directly over Nadine, using height and position to communicate what words had not achieved. "Final chance. Stand up, turn around, hands behind your back. We're going to have a conversation at the station, and you can quote as many statutes as you want to my supervisor." Nadine looked up at the sergeant, calculating the moment, weighing the consequences of compliance against the consequences of continued resistance. She had made her points. She had documented the encounter. She had established a record that would speak for itself regardless of what happened next. Now the question was how far she was willing to let this go, how much of her own dignity she was prepared to sacrifice in service of the larger documentation she was building. She stood slowly, keeping her hands visible, moving with the deliberate care of someone who understood how quickly gestures could be misinterpreted and how severe the consequences of misinterpretation could be. Her book remained on the bench. Her coffee cup sat forgotten beside it. Her phone continued recording, face down, capturing audio that would matter later, even if it could not help her now. "I'm standing," she said quietly. "I'm not resisting, but I want it on record that I am complying under protest with what I believe is an unlawful detention." "Noted." Whitfield's voice carried no warmth. "Now turn around." Nadine turned. The handcuffs appeared, metal catching morning light, clicking into place around her wrists with the practiced efficiency of routine. They were tight, tighter than necessary, the small cruelty that accompanied enforcement actions taken in frustration. She noted the pressure, the pinch of metal against bone, another detail for the record she was building. The crowd had grown. Phones continued recording. The woman in yoga pants had retreated further toward the playground, her expression now more troubled than satisfied, perhaps beginning to understand that her phone call had set something larger in motion. The joggers had stopped jogging. The dog walkers had gathered near the water fountain, their pets forgotten at their feet. Saturday morning had transformed into spectacle. "My name is Nadine Holloway." She spoke clearly, projecting her voice toward the phones and witnesses without turning to face them. "It is 9:47 a.m. on Saturday, May 17th. I am being physically restrained without arrest or stated cause. The officers involved are Sergeant P. Whitfield and Officer M. Gentry of the City Police Department. Their badge numbers are visible on their uniforms." Gentry's hand gripped her shoulder, spinning her to face him. "Stop talking. I'm documenting for the record. That's not illegal. You're making things worse for yourself." "I'm exercising my First Amendment right to free speech while in police custody. If that makes things worse, the problem is with your procedures, not my speech." His grip tightened. She felt the pressure increase, the edge of pain that stopped just short of anything that would leave marks, the kind of force that taught lessons without creating evidence, the kind that happened in the space between cameras, in moments too brief to capture, in encounters that would become word against word when questions were asked later. "Officer Gentry." A new voice, different from the others, carrying authority that the previous speakers had not possessed. "Remove your hand from the subject." Gentry released her as though burned, stepping back with an expression that cycled through surprise and alarm before settling into defensive neutrality. The crowd shifted, their attention moving toward the newcomer, phones tracking the latest arrival. A man stood at the edge of the scene, older than Gentry but younger than Whitfield, carrying himself with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to read situations before entering them. He wore a camera around his neck, professional grade, and a press credential visible against his chest. His dark skin caught the morning light, and his eyes moved across the assembled officers with the quick assessment of someone who had witnessed many encounters like this one. He did not identify himself, did not need to. The camera and credential spoke for him, establishing his role, his protections, his right to observe and document. His attention settled on Nadine, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps. Or confusion. A micro-expression that was there and gone before it could be fully interpreted, replaced by the neutral mask of professional observation. Whitfield's voice cut through the moment. "This is police business. Press stays back. Public street, public park, public servants performing public duties." His response was calm, measured, the practiced language of someone who had negotiated these boundaries before. "I'll stay out of your way, Sergeant, but I'm not going anywhere." The standoff held for 3 seconds, then 5, then 7. Whitfield calculating the additional complications that came with press attention. Brennan recalculating whatever strategy he had been building. Gentry nursing wounded pride and wariness in equal measure. The crowd continuing to record, to witness, to transform the encounter into something that could not be contained within official reports. And Nadine Holloway, hands cuffed behind her back, watched it all unfold with the patience of someone who had been waiting for this moment without knowing exactly when or how it would arrive. The back of the patrol car smelled like industrial disinfectant and accumulated human stress. The particular odor of countless previous occupants who had sat in this same space under various circumstances of desperation. Nadine rested her shoulder blades against the hard plastic seat, her bound hands forcing an awkward posture that was clearly intentional in its discomfort. Through the window she could see Whitfield and Gentry in conference with Brennan, their body language suggesting disagreement about something significant. The journalist with the press credential had positioned himself 30 feet away, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid claims of interference. His camera was not raised, but his phone was, held casually at waist height in the way of someone documenting while appearing not to document. Nadine had not recognized him, but something about the way he had looked at her suggested he might have recognized something about her. Her phone was gone, confiscated along with her other belongings, placed in an evidence bag that Gentry had sealed with performative thoroughness. But she had seen enough of the scene before being placed in the vehicle to know that the documentation continued without her participation. At least 15 witnesses had been recording. The journalist's presence meant professional coverage was likely. Whatever happened next would happen with an audience that extended far beyond this park. She watched Brennan separate from the group and pull out his phone, scrolling through something with increasing agitation. His face changed as he read, the practiced calm giving way to something that looked very much like alarm. He spoke rapidly into the phone, listened, spoke again. Then he walked back to Whitfield and showed her the screen. Nadine could not see what they were looking at, but she could see its effect. Whitfield went very still. Gentry leaned in to look, then stepped back as though the screen had physically struck him. Brennan was speaking rapidly, gesturing toward the patrol car, toward the crowd, toward something beyond the immediate scene that had suddenly become the dominant factor in whatever calculations they were making. The car door opened. Whitfield stood in the frame, her expression complicated in ways that had not been present before. Professional distance warred with something else, something that might have been concern or might have been fear about consequences that had not previously seemed relevant. Ms. Holloway. The use of her name, rather than ma'am or subject, was the first indication that something had changed. "We're going to continue our conversation here rather than at the station, if that's acceptable to you." I've been detained without cause and handcuffed without arrest. My acceptability isn't really the issue at this point, is it? I'm trying to... Whitfield stopped, started again. There seems to have been some confusion about the nature of this situation. I'm attempting to resolve it as professionally as possible, given the circumstances. The circumstances being that you've detained a citizen who committed no crime based on a phone call that described no criminal activity, and now you've discovered something that complicates your plan to transport her to the station for further questioning. Whitfield's jaw tightened. Something like that. What did you find on your phone, Sergeant? That's not your concern? Given that I'm the one in handcuffs, I think it very much is my concern. Before Whitfield could respond, another vehicle entered the parking lot. Not a patrol car, not an unmarked sedan, but a black SUV with city plates and no lights or markings. The kind of vehicle that announced importance without advertising specifics. The kind that carried people who were accustomed to immediate access and immediate answers. The man who emerged was tall, silver-haired, wearing a uniform that bore the rank of deputy chief. His presence changed the atmosphere of the scene instantly, the officers straightening, the crowd stirring with recognition of elevated authority. He approached with the measured stride of someone who expected obstacles to remove themselves from his path. Deputy Chief Warren Sloan had served the department for 31 years, rising through the ranks with the particular combination of competence and political skill that characterized successful institutional survivors. He had endorsed Nadine's opponent in the mayoral race, had spoken publicly about his concerns regarding the new administration's reform agenda, had positioned himself as the voice of traditional policing in a department facing demands for change. He reached the patrol car and looked through the window at the woman seated inside, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Then he turned to Whitfield. "Get her out of that vehicle, now, and turn off every camera you're wearing." The order violated departmental policy. Georgia Senate Bill 236, enacted in 2021, required continuous body cam recording during all citizen encounters, with specific prohibitions against officers deactivating cameras until situations were fully resolved. Nadine had been briefed on the policy during transition meetings. She had planned to strengthen it as part of her reform agenda. Now she was witnessing its violation in real time. "Sir, the body cam policy requires..." "I know what the policy requires. I'm giving you a direct order. Turn off your cameras." Whitfield hesitated, calculating the competing pressures of policy compliance and command authority. Her hand moved to her chest, where the small device was mounted, fingers hovering over the controls without yet acting. "Ma'am?" The journalist's voice carried from his position 30 feet away. "For the record, would you like to state whether you believe the order you just received is lawful?" Sloan turned toward the speaker, his expression darkening. "This is a restricted area. Press needs to move back. I'm on public property, observing public servants. No court order restricts my presence here. And I've been recording since I arrived, so whatever conversation you're trying to have in private is already documented." The standoff extended, seconds stretching into something that felt much longer. The morning sun continued its indifferent arc across the sky. The crowd continued recording. The children on the playground, oblivious to the drama unfolding nearby, continued their games with the simple enthusiasm of people who had not yet learned that Saturday mornings could turn complicated. Sloan made a decision. He turned back to the patrol car, opened the door himself, and extended a hand to assist Nadine in exiting. The gesture was correct in form, courteous in execution, and deeply strange given everything that had preceded it. "Mayor Holloway." His voice carried just enough for nearby witnesses to hear, the title dropping into the scene like a stone into still water. "I apologize for my officer's behavior. There appears to have been a significant misunderstanding." The word mayor rippled outward through the gathered crowd, passing from witness to witness in whispered repetitions that grew louder with each transmission. Phones that had been recording shifted angles, zoomed in, captured the moment from every available perspective. The journalist stepped forward, his professional neutrality giving way to something closer to vindication, as though a suspicion had just been confirmed. Gentry's face drained of color. His mouth opened, closed, opened again without producing sound. The arithmetic of his situation was suddenly and brutally clear. He had not just detained a difficult citizen who might file a complaint. He had laid hands on the elected leader of the city, the commander of the department, the person who would ultimately decide whether his career continued or ended. Whitfield showed more composure, but her eyes betrayed the same calculation. 23 years on the force, pension eligibility in 2 more, a husband, 2 children, a mortgage on a house in the suburbs. All of it suddenly contingent on what happened in the next few minutes and how the woman in handcuffs chose to respond. Brennan had retreated several steps, his union representative role suddenly complicated by the fact that the person his officers had targeted was the mayor who had campaigned on accountability reform. His phone remained pressed to his ear, his voice too low to carry, his expression suggesting that whatever conversation he was having was not going well. Diana Vance, the woman who had started all of this with her 911 call, stood frozen near the playground, her daughter's calls for attention going unanswered. Her face showed the particular distress of someone who had expected validation and received instead the dawning understanding of catastrophic miscalculation. Nadine remained still, her hands bound behind her back, her attention focused on the deputy chief who had just addressed her by title. The posture of submission was unchanged, but the dynamic of the encounter had shifted fundamentally. She was no longer an anonymous citizen navigating police authority. She was the authority itself, temporarily constrained by officers who had not understood who they were constraining. Deputy Chief Sloan. Her voice carried the same calm that had characterized her throughout the encounter, but the quality of that calm had transformed. It was no longer the patience of someone managing an unjust situation. It was the composure of someone who held power and was deciding how to use it. I appreciate the courtesy, but I should inform you that I've been recording this encounter since your officers arrived, as have approximately 15 members of the public, and I believe someone from Internal Affairs was recently briefed about this situation. As if summoned by the mention, a second vehicle pulled into the parking lot. A woman emerged, badge visible on her belt, wearing the business casual of an investigator rather than the uniform of patrol. Sergeant Rosa Medina, Internal Affairs Division, moved toward the scene with the careful intensity of someone who had been following events closely and had chosen this precise moment to appear. How did she know? Gentry's voice was barely audible, the question directed at no one in particular. Because I called her. Nadine's response carried clearly. My phone may be in your evidence bag, but the recording uploaded to cloud backup the moment it started. Automatic sync. Standard practice for anyone who knows that documentation sometimes needs to survive confiscation. Medina reached the group and assessed the situation with quick, practiced efficiency. Her attention moved from Sloan to Whitfield to the handcuffs still restraining the mayor's wrists. Her expression revealed nothing, but her first action spoke volumes. She pulled out her own phone and began recording. Ma'am, Sergeant Rosa Medina, Internal Affairs. I received a complaint referencing this location and responded as quickly as possible. Are you injured? Sergeant Whitfield applied restraints tighter than necessary. My wrists will likely show marks. Otherwise, no physical injuries. The encounter has been documented thoroughly. And the complaint you filed was based on unlawful detention, failure to articulate reasonable suspicion, threats of false charges, inappropriate use of restraints on a citizen who posed no threat and committed no resistance. Nadine spoke with the precision of someone providing a statement, each element of the complaint delivered with clinical clarity. I'll provide a full written account including timestamps, but I wanted the initial complaint on record immediately. Sloan stepped forward, inserting himself between Medina and the mayor. Sergeant, I'm handling this situation. Internal Affairs involvement isn't necessary. With respect, sir, a complaint has been filed. That triggers mandatory investigation protocols under department policy. I'm required to document the scene and take initial statements. You're required to follow chain of command, which means deferring to superior officers on scene. Sir, internal affairs operates independently precisely to avoid chain-of-command conflicts in situations like this. I'm following protocol. If you have concerns, you're welcome to file an objection with the chief's office. The masks are coming off, and the real battle is just beginning. Subscribe now so you don't miss how this confrontation unfolds. The tension between deputy chief and investigator crackled with institutional implications that extended far beyond this morning's events. Medina's independence was exactly what Nadine's reform agenda sought to strengthen. Sloane's resistance was exactly what that agenda sought to overcome. The park had become a microcosm of a larger struggle, with witnesses and cameras capturing every moment. "Deputy Chief?" Nadine's voice cut through the standoff. "I'm still handcuffed. Perhaps that could be addressed before we continue discussing jurisdictional questions." The reminder landed with visible impact. Sloane's face showed the calculation of someone realizing how the current scene would look in photographs, in video clips, in the media coverage that was now inevitable. The mayor of the city, hands bound behind her back, surrounded by officers who had not yet released her. The optics were devastating. "Sergeant Whitfield, remove the restraints. Immediately." Whitfield moved toward Nadine, key already in hand, her movements carrying the mechanical quality of someone operating on professional autopilot, while her mind raced through implications and consequences. The handcuffs clicked open. Nadine brought her hands forward, rotating her wrists, examining the red marks that had already begun to form against her skin. "These will need to be photographed." Medina's statement was matter-of-fact, evidence collection rather than commentary. "For the file." "Of course." Nadine held her wrists out, allowing the internal affairs sergeant to document the marks with her phone camera. "Time-stamped, I assume?" "Standard procedure, ma'am." The formality felt strange now, after everything that had transpired. "Ma'am" and "sir," the polite distances of professional interaction, applied to a situation that had involved neither politeness nor professionalism until approximately 3 minutes ago. But the formality served its purpose, creating a record that would be defensible, that would demonstrate everyone following correct protocols from the moment the truth emerged. Nadine retrieved her belongings from the evidence bag that Gentry had prepared. Her phone, still recording, still backing up to the cloud. Her book, page still marked with the hardware store receipt. Her coffee cup, contents cold and forgotten. The simple objects of a Saturday morning that had become evidence in what would likely be one of the most scrutinized encounters in the department's recent history. She checked her phone, verified the recording was intact, then placed it in her pocket without ending the session. Documentation would continue until she was safely away from this scene. Possibly longer. Trust had not been rebuilt with apologies and removed handcuffs. Trust would be rebuilt, if at all, through processes that had barely begun. "Sergeant Medina?" She spoke formally, establishing the proper distance between witness and investigator. "I will provide a full written statement within 24 hours. I'll also be providing copies of all recordings to your office, and I expect updates on your investigation at appropriate intervals." "Understood, ma'am. We take all complaints seriously. This one in particular, I hope, because everything that happened here is going to be very public very quickly, and the department's response will determine a great deal about what comes next." She turned to face Sloane, Whitfield, Gentry, and Brennan. 4 representatives of the system she had been elected to reform. 4 people whose careers and choices had brought them to this moment. 4 individuals who would be named in the report she would file, the investigation that would follow, the public accounting that was now inevitable. "I came to this park because I wanted to understand how my city treats citizens who haven't done anything wrong. I wanted to see what happens when someone's presence is questioned, not because of their actions, but because of their appearance. I wanted to know what my officers do when they think no one important is watching." She paused, letting the words settle. "Now I know." Sloane's expression remained controlled, but something behind his eyes suggested he understood the implications of what she had said. This had not been accidental. The mayor had deliberately placed herself in a position to experience what ordinary citizens experienced. She had documented every moment, and now she had ammunition for reform efforts that he had opposed since before her election. "Mayor Holloway," his voice was careful, diplomatic. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately, find a mutually agreeable way to address whatever concerns have arisen." "There's nothing private about civil rights, Deputy Chief. What happened here happened in public, was witnessed by the public, and will be addressed through public processes. That's what accountability looks like." She turned toward the parking lot, toward the journalist who had been recording throughout, toward the gathered crowd who still held their phones aloft. The morning sun caught her face, illuminating features that were about to become very familiar to her city's residents, attached to a story that would be told and retold in the coming days. "Mr. Boyd," she addressed the journalist by name, recognizing him now from press events during her transition. "I believe you have questions." Terrence Boyd lowered his phone and stepped forward, press credential visible, professional instincts engaged. "Mayor Holloway, for the record, can you describe what happened here this morning?" "I was detained by police officers while reading on a public park bench. The basis for my detention was a 911 call from a woman who found my presence unsettling. I was handcuffed, threatened with arrest on fabricated charges, and held in a patrol car until someone discovered my identity and informed the responding officers of their mistake." "And your response?" "I'm filing a formal complaint with Internal Affairs. I'm requesting that the encounter be investigated under department misconduct protocols, and I'm calling an emergency session of the City Council to address what this incident reveals about policing practices in our city." She paused, letting the weight of her words register. "The treatment I receive today is the treatment citizens receive every day. The difference is that my position gives me the ability to demand accountability. Most people don't have that luxury. That changes starting now." The crowd stirred. Some faces showed approval, others concern, others the complicated mix of emotions that accompanied moments of institutional disruption. The officers remained clustered near their vehicles, their futures suddenly uncertain, their assumptions about who held power in this city suddenly and dramatically revised. Diana Vance had finally retrieved her daughter from the playground. She stood at the edge of the scene. Her earlier confidence collapsed into something that looked like dawning horror. Her 911 call, made from the certainty that she was protecting her neighborhood from an unwelcome presence, had instead exposed exactly the patterns of discrimination that the new mayor had promised to address. She would be named in reports. She would be quoted in news stories. She would forever be associated with this moment when her discomfort had been transformed into evidence of systemic failure. Nadine felt no satisfaction in the woman's distress. The encounter had unfolded as she had anticipated when she first began her observation walks, but anticipation did not translate to pleasure. She had wanted to understand her city's problems. She had found them. Now she had to fix them, and that work would be harder, messier, and longer than any single morning in any single park. But it would begin here. It would begin now. It would begin with the documentation she had gathered, the witnesses who had recorded, the institutional processes she was about to activate. She walked toward her car, parked 3 blocks away where she had left it when she first arrived this morning. The journalist followed at a respectful distance, continuing to document. The crowd began to disperse, conversations buzzing with the energy of people who had witnessed something significant and could not wait to tell others about it. Behind her, Deputy Chief Warren Sloan watched her departure with an expression that promised complications ahead. The battle she had sought was now officially joined. The outcomes remained uncertain, but the first engagement had happened, and she had not backed down. She had not even flinched. The City Council chambers filled to capacity by 3 that afternoon, word of the morning's events having spread through official channels and social media with approximately equal speed. The emergency session Nadine had requested was technically improper, requiring 24 hours' notice under normal circumstances, but the council president had waived the requirement under the provision for matters of urgent public concern. Media lined the back wall, cameras and microphones creating a gallery of documentation that would preserve whatever happened next for review and analysis. The citizen comment section had been extended from its usual 15 minutes to 30, with over 50 people having signed up to speak before the sign-up sheet was closed. Nadine sat at the elevated platform with her fellow council members, her position as mayor placing her at the center of the curved desk that faced the assembly. Her wrists bore faint bruising where the handcuffs had pressed too tightly, visible when she moved her hands in certain ways, documented in photographs that had already been submitted to Internal Affairs. City Attorney Jerome Haskell sat to her right, his legal pad filled with notes about procedures and precedents and the various regulatory frameworks that would govern whatever actions the council chose to take. He had spent the afternoon reviewing the recordings from the park, comparing them against department policy and state law, identifying the specific violations that had occurred and the remedies available. The public comment period began with residents who had witnessed the morning's events, their testimonies adding perspective to the videos that were already circulating online. A retired teacher described watching from near the water fountain, her voice shaking with anger about what she had seen. A young father spoke about explaining to his son why police officers were putting a woman in handcuffs when she had not done anything wrong. An elderly black man, voice steady with the patience of someone who had seen similar things throughout his life, noted simply that he was not surprised, only saddened that it was still happening. Diana Vance did not appear to speak. Her absence was noted by several commenters who referenced the 911 call that had initiated the encounter and questioned the motivations behind it. The recording of that call had been obtained through a rapid public records request by Terrence Boyd and published on his newspaper's website 3 hours after the events concluded. Her words, "She doesn't belong here," and "you know how it is," had already become the phrases that defined the incident in public discussion. When the comment period concluded, Haskell rose to present the preliminary legal findings his office had developed. His delivery was measured, careful, the approach of an attorney who understood that every word was being recorded and might later be examined in legal proceedings. Based on the evidence available, it is the preliminary finding of this office that the detention of Mayor Holloway violated both department policy and Georgia state law. He spoke without notes, his preparation evident in the precision of his language. Specifically, the officers failed to articulate reasonable suspicion as required under OCG, A Section 16-11-36. The threats of charges under the obstruction and disorderly conduct statutes had no factual or legal basis, and the order by Deputy Chief Sloan to deactivate body cams violated department policy established under State Senate Bill 236. He paused, allowing the findings to register with the audience and the cameras. Additionally, this office has identified potential violations of federal civil rights law, specifically Title 18 United States Code Section 242, which prohibits the deprivation of rights under color of law. We are referring this matter to the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia for review and possible prosecution. The murmur that passed through the chamber at the mention of federal prosecution suggested that the audience understood the significance. Local officers facing federal charges, civil rights violations investigated at the highest levels, the kinds of consequences that usually happened elsewhere to other departments in other cities. Councilmember Patricia Hammond, who represented the district that included Riverside Park, spoke first during the deliberation period. "I've lived in this city for 42 years. I've watched our police department, supported our police department, defended our police department when others criticized it. But what I saw in those videos today was not the department I thought I knew. It was not the service and protection we were promised. It was authority without accountability, power without restraint." She turned to address the cameras directly, departing from the usual protocol of speaking to fellow council members. "To every resident of this city who has experienced what Mayor Holloway experienced today, we see you, we believe you, and we are going to do something about it." Councilmember Robert Chen nodded in agreement. "I'll be honest, I had my doubts about some of the reform proposals that came out of the mayor's transition team. I thought they might be too aggressive, might damage the relationship between our officers and our community. After today, I think they might not be aggressive enough." Diana Vance's council seat, which covered the wealthier neighborhoods on the city's west side, sat occupied by Diana Vance herself. Her presence was a surprise. Many had expected her to remain absent given her role in initiating the encounter. She sat rigidly, her expression controlled, her hands folded on the desk in front of her. When her turn to speak arrived, the chamber quieted with anticipation. "I made a mistake." Her voice was tight, the words forced past whatever resistance her pride was mounting. "I saw something that concerned me, and I acted on that concern without fully considering what I was doing or why I was doing it. I called the police on a woman who was doing nothing wrong because I felt uncomfortable with her presence, and I realize now that my discomfort was not a legitimate basis for police action." She paused, and for a moment it seemed she might say more, might offer more detailed explanation or apology. Instead, she simply concluded, "I recuse myself from any votes related to this matter due to my involvement, and I will be issuing a formal apology to Mayor Holloway directly." The recusal was proper, perhaps necessary, but it also carried political implications. Diana Vance had been a reliable vote against accountability measures, one of the council members most closely aligned with the police union's positions. Her absence from the voting block changed the arithmetic of what could pass and what would fail. The vote came after 2 more hours of deliberation, during which department representatives were given the opportunity to respond, and union officials were permitted to speak in defense of the officers involved. Kyle Brennan, his earlier confidence diminished but not eliminated, argued that the officers had responded to a legitimate call and followed their training. "What happened today was a situation that escalated due to the subject's refusal to cooperate," he said, apparently not registering the irony of referring to the mayor as the subject in chambers where she was literally presiding. "Our officers made judgment calls in a dynamic situation. Those calls may have been imperfect, but they were not malicious." The council voted 4-1, with one recusal, to place Officers Gentry and Whitfield on administrative leave pending the completion of the internal affairs investigation. They voted 5-0 to request a federal pattern or practice review of the department's stop and detention practices, and they voted 4-1 to establish a civilian oversight board with subpoena power, a reform that had been proposed during the mayoral campaign but had lacked the votes to pass until this afternoon. Deputy Chief Sloan was not present for the session. His absence was explained as a previously scheduled commitment, but the timing suggested something closer to strategic retreat. He would need to be addressed eventually, but the mechanisms for holding command staff accountable operated on different timelines than those for patrol officers. By the time the session concluded, the sun had set, and the chamber's artificial lights cast harsh shadows across tired faces. The work was not finished. Investigations would take weeks. Federal review would take months. The deeper changes to policy and culture that were needed would take years. But something had shifted. Some momentum had been generated. Some accountability had been established that would be difficult to reverse. Nadine gathered her materials and prepared to leave, surrounded by council members who wanted to express support and staff members who needed guidance on next steps. The journalist, Boyd, had remained throughout, his notes filling multiple pages, his recorder capturing testimony that would become part of the historical record. She caught his eye as she moved toward the exit, and he approached with the careful professionalism of someone who understood boundaries but also opportunities. "Mayor Holloway, one more question, if you have a moment." She paused, nodded. "You said this morning that you went to that park to understand how your city treats citizens who haven't done anything wrong. You found your answer. What comes next?" She considered the question, its implications, its invitation to sum up something that could not be easily summarized. What comes next is the work. The slow, difficult, frustrating work of changing systems that have operated a certain way for a very long time. What happened today made that work more visible, gave it more support. But visibility and support don't automatically become change. They become opportunity. What we do with that opportunity determines whether today was a turning point or just another incident that fades from memory. And your prediction for which it will be? I don't make predictions, Mr. Boyd. I make plans, and then I execute them with whatever support I can gather and whatever obstacles I have to overcome. She paused at the door, the evening air carrying the coolness of late spring. Ask me in a year whether we succeeded. I'll have an answer for you then. She walked into the night, toward a city that was watching, waiting, and wondering what would happen next. 3 weeks passed. The investigation progressed through channels that operated slowly by design, each interview scheduled and rescheduled, each document reviewed and reviewed again. The officers remained on administrative leave, collecting their salaries while their futures were decided by processes they could not control. The federal prosecutor's office acknowledged receipt of the referral and promised review, but declined to comment on timing or likely outcomes. Nadine received updates through official channels and unofficial ones, the formal reports from Sergeant Medina supplemented by the informal networks that every politician cultivated. The body cam footage from the officers' cameras had been preserved, time-stamped, and cataloged. Hers showed the full encounter from arrival to departure. Theirs showed a 6-minute gap between 9:38, when they logged their arrival on scene, and 9:44, when their cameras apparently began recording. The gap was troubling. Department policy required continuous recording from the moment of citizen contact. 6 minutes of missing footage suggested either equipment malfunction or deliberate deactivation. IT analysis was inconclusive. The footage might have been manually paused, might have been deleted, might have simply failed to record due to technical failure. The uncertainty was itself a kind of evidence, suggesting either incompetence or cover-up, neither of which reflected well on the officers involved. Medina delivered her preliminary findings at the end of the 3rd week, her report running to 47 pages of documented violations, witness statements, and technical analysis. The executive summary was damning but careful, the language of a professional who understood that her conclusions would be scrutinized by lawyers on multiple sides. Officers Gentry and Whitfield failed to articulate reasonable suspicion for the detention of the complainant, the summary read. Their stated justifications, including disorderly conduct and obstruction, were not supported by the facts as documented. The evidence suggests a pattern of conduct inconsistent with department training and policy. The section on Deputy Chief Sloan was more careful, acknowledging his order to deactivate cameras, but noting that officers had discretion in how to interpret such orders. The careful language suggested political considerations that transcended the specific incident, acknowledging that removing a deputy chief required different processes and carried different implications than disciplining patrol officers. The City Council held its second session on the matter on a Tuesday evening, the gallery again packed, the cameras again rolling. The vote to formally charge Officers Gentry and Whitfield with policy violations passed unanimously, including a vote from a recently appointed replacement who had filled the seat Diana Vance had vacated 3 days after the incident. Her resignation letter had cited personal reasons, but the timing made its true motivation clear. The officers would face a disciplinary board that could result in suspension without pay, demotion, or termination. Their union had already filed grievances challenging the process, arguing procedural irregularities that would take months to resolve. The system's machinery ground slowly, but it ground. The federal announcement came 4 days later, delivered through a press release from the United States Attorney's Office. A pattern or practice investigation had been opened into the city's police department, examining whether the department had engaged in a pattern of constitutional violations, particularly regarding stops, detentions, and use of force against minority residents. The investigation would review years of data, interview dozens of witnesses, and result in findings that could mandate court-supervised reforms. Nadine received the news in her office, surrounded by staff who had worked toward this outcome since before the election. The press release language was bureaucratic, careful, but its implications were clear. Federal oversight was coming, with or without the department's cooperation. The reforms she had promised were no longer optional. They had become mandatory, backed by the authority of federal law. She should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt the particular weariness of someone who understood that winning one battle only revealed how many more remained to fight. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief. "Check your email. You should know what happened in those 6 minutes." She opened her email application and found a new message from an address she did not recognize, with an attachment that her system flagged as potentially unsafe. The subject line read simply, "Documentation." The attachment, when she finally opened it after appropriate security precautions, contained an audio file, 5 minutes and 47 seconds long, time-stamped to 9:38 a.m. on the morning of her detention, the 6 minutes that had been missing from the official record. She listened with headphones, alone in her office, as the voices of Officers Gentry and Whitfield filled her ears. "That's her. The woman from the news. The one who's been coming here." "You sure?" "I'm telling you, I've seen her picture. She's doing some kind of investigation, testing us or something." "So what do we do?" "We follow protocol, see what happens. If she cooperates, nothing to report. If she doesn't, we document her being uncooperative, build a record." "Exactly. She wants to play games, we play games better." The recording continued, but Nadine had heard enough. The officers had known, or suspected, who she was before they approached. The encounter had not been a mistake born of ignorance. It had been a calculated attempt to document her as problematic, to build a case against her through manufactured non-compliance, to use the tools of law enforcement against the person who had been elected to oversee that enforcement. She sat in the darkness of her office. The recording ended, the implications settling around her like fog. The fight was not just against bad practices or poorly trained officers. It was against deliberate resistance, coordinated opposition, a system that protected itself by attacking those who challenged it. Her phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Another brief message. More coming. The body cam gap wasn't an accident. Sloan ordered it deleted. Proof attached. She did not open the attachment. Not yet. Not alone. Instead, she called Sergeant Medina. "I have something you need to see, and I think we need to talk about how deep this actually goes." The morning in the park had been just the beginning. The real investigation was starting now. The park bench where it all began sat empty now. Someone had removed it 3 days after the council hearing, claiming damage that required off-site repair. City maintenance confirmed the work order but could not locate documentation authorizing the removal. The bench had simply vanished, along with any chance of someone sitting in the same spot, reading the same kind of book, waiting to see what would happen. But the space it had occupied remained, marked now by a worn patch of grass that refused to fill in where countless feet had tread. People who knew the story sometimes paused there, taking photographs of nothing, documenting the absence that had become its own kind of evidence. The story continued beyond that absence, through hearings and investigations, and the slow accumulation of accountability that looked nothing like the dramatic resolutions of television drama. Officers faced administrative boards. Policies were revised. Training programs were updated. The federal investigation expanded, then contracted, then expanded again as new evidence emerged and old assumptions were challenged. Deputy Chief Warren Sloan announced his retirement 6 weeks after the incident, citing 31 years of service and a desire to spend more time with his family. The announcement came 3 days before a scheduled hearing where he would have been required to explain his order to deactivate body cams. His pension remained intact. His legacy remained complicated. Kyle Brennan was promoted to regional union leadership, his handling of the incident apparently viewed as sufficiently competent by those who made such decisions. The union's opposition to reform measures continued unabated, if slightly more careful in its public statements. Terrence Boyd's article won an award for investigative journalism, his documentation of the encounter cited as an example of the press serving its democratic function. He continued covering the police beat, his access to department sources both enhanced and complicated by his role in the most scrutinized incident in recent memory. Rosa Medina was promoted to lieutenant, her handling of the investigation earning recognition from both the mayor's office and reform advocates who saw her as a model of what accountability could look like within the system. She continued her work, one case at a time, building the kind of record that created precedent for future cases. And Nadine Holloway continued her morning walks, though she varied her routes more carefully now, and always carried her phone with the recording application ready to activate. The encounters she experienced were gentler than before, officers recognizing her face and adjusting their behavior accordingly. But she knew that the officers' recognition of her face was itself the problem, not the solution. Real change would arrive when officers treated every citizen with the same respect they now showed her, not because they recognized authority, but because they recognized humanity. That change remained distant, perhaps unreachable, perhaps worth pursuing anyway. She returned to the park one morning, 3 months after the incident, and stood in the space where the bench had been. The grass was still worn. The view was still beautiful. The Saturday morning sounds were still peaceful in the way they had always been, children laughing and joggers passing and dogs barking at squirrels they would never catch. She stood there for several minutes, remembering and not remembering, thinking about what had happened and what still needed to happen. Then she walked away, toward a city that was changing slowly, painfully, incompletely, in ways that were visible only if you knew where to look and only if you were willing to wait long enough to see them. The fight continued. The work continued. The hope, stubborn and unreasonable, continued as well. And somewhere in the files of the ongoing investigation, an audio recording waited to reveal exactly what had happened in those 6 missing minutes, and exactly who had ordered the evidence destroyed, and exactly how deep the resistance to change actually went. The answers would come eventually. They always did. The only question was whether they would arrive in time to matter, and who would still be listening when they finally emerged from the silence. The audio file played through the conference room speakers with the compressed quality of digital recording, voices rendered slightly metallic but unmistakably clear. Sergeant Rosa Medina sat across the table from Nadine, her notepad already filled with observations, her expression the careful neutrality of someone processing information that would complicate everything. "That's Gentry's voice," Medina confirmed when the recording ended. "And Whitfield. I've interviewed both of them enough times to recognize them. They knew who I was before they approached, or at least suspected. That's what the recording suggests." Nadine leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking slightly in the silence that followed. The conference room occupied the corner of the 3rd floor of City Hall, its windows overlooking the same downtown streets where patrol cars moved through their regular routes, officers performing the duties that public trust required and recent events had called into question. "The implications are significant," she said finally. "If they knew my identity and proceeded anyway, this wasn't a training failure. It was deliberate targeting. Potentially. But the recording raises questions about chain of custody. We received it from an anonymous source. Defense attorneys will challenge its authenticity, argue it could have been manipulated, claim it's inadmissible. Can your technical people verify it? They can try. Audio forensics can establish whether recordings have been edited or spliced. But verification takes time, and even verified recordings can be challenged in proceedings. Medina paused, choosing her next words carefully. There's also the question of where this came from. Someone inside the department had access to this audio. Someone preserved it when the official body cam footage was deleted or corrupted. That person is either a whistleblower or someone playing a longer game. The second attachment from the anonymous email remained unopened on Nadine's laptop. The message had promised proof that Deputy Chief Sloan had ordered the body cam footage deleted. If that proof existed, if it was authentic, if it could be verified, the implications extended far beyond 2 patrol officers exceeding their authority on a Saturday morning. "Should I open it?" Nadine asked. Medina considered. "Legally, you have every right to review evidence related to a complaint you filed. Practically anything you see becomes something you know, and knowledge creates obligations. Once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. I became mayor to address exactly these kinds of problems. I can't address them by looking away." She opened the attachment. The document was an internal email, dated 4 days after the incident, sent from an account identified only by initials, WS. The recipient list was redacted, black bars covering names that someone had decided should remain hidden. But the body of the email was fully visible, its language blunt and unambiguous. The body cam footage from the Riverside Park incident needs to be handled. I've spoken with IT about technical issues that could explain gaps in recording. Make sure the official narrative reflects equipment malfunction, not officer error. This stays internal, no documentation that could be discoverable. The signature block identified the sender as Deputy Chief Warren Sloan. Medina read the email twice, her expression shifting from neutral to something closer to controlled alarm. If this is authentic, it's obstruction of justice, possibly conspiracy, and it implicates the second highest ranking officer in the department. If it's authentic, yes, if. They sat with the weight of that conditional, the single word that separated allegation from evidence, suspicion from proof. The email looked genuine. The language sounded like Sloan. The timing aligned with what they knew about the investigation's early days. But authenticity required verification, and verification required processes that took weeks or months, not hours or days. "What's our next move?" Nadine asked. "I escalate to the chief's office. This is beyond my authority to investigate independently. Sloan outranks me significantly, and any investigation of command staff requires authorization from above." Medina paused. "There's also the federal inquiry to consider. If we've received evidence of obstruction, we may have an obligation to share it with the U.S. Attorney's Office." "Do it. Share everything. I didn't run for this office to protect people who abuse their authority, regardless of their rank. That decision may have political consequences. Everything has political consequences. But some things are more important than politics." Medina gathered her materials, the notepad and recorder and copies of documents that would become part of an expanding investigation. At the door, she paused. "Mayor Holloway. For what it's worth, most officers I know joined this department because they wanted to help people. They're not all like Gentry and Whitfield. They're not all protecting Sloan. Some of them are watching what happens here, hoping it turns out differently than these things usually do. I know. That's why this matters. Not just for the officers who did wrong, but for the ones who are trying to do right." Medina left. Nadine remained in the conference room, the email still displayed on her laptop screen, the words evidence of either systemic corruption or elaborate deception, and she could not yet be certain which. The conspiracy goes deeper than anyone imagined. If you want to see how this unfolds, make sure you're subscribed because the revelations ahead will change everything. Check 2. The federal investigators arrived 6 weeks after the pattern or practice inquiry was announced, a team of 4 attorneys and 2 technical specialists from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. They established themselves in borrowed office space on the 4th floor of the federal courthouse, their presence announced through official channels and amplified through the informal networks that connected every institution in the city. Lead investigator Patricia Thornton had spent 18 years building civil rights cases against police departments across the country. Her record included consent decrees in 3 major cities, forced reforms in half a dozen others, and a reputation for thoroughness that defense attorneys both respected and feared. When she requested a meeting with the mayor during her first week in the city, Nadine understood that the request was more formality than optional. They met in the mayor's office on a Thursday afternoon, the late spring sun casting long shadows through windows that overlooked a city navigating unfamiliar territory. Thornton was shorter than Nadine had expected, compact and precise in her movements, with eyes that seemed to catalog everything they observed. "Mayor Holloway, thank you for making time. Ms. Thornton, I've been looking forward to this conversation." "I imagine you have. You're in an unusual position, both the complainant who initiated much of this scrutiny and the chief executive responsible for the department being scrutinized. That creates complexities, I'm aware. I've tried to maintain appropriate separation between my personal experience and my official responsibilities." Thornton nodded, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. "Let me be direct about our process. We're conducting an independent investigation into whether your police department has engaged in a pattern or practice of violating constitutional rights. Your incident is part of our review, but it's not the focus. We're looking at years of data, hundreds of encounters, systemic patterns rather than individual cases." I understand. What I need from you is cooperation without interference, access to records, personnel, facilities, and a commitment that you won't use your position to influence our findings, either to benefit officers you might want to protect or to punish those you might want to see disciplined. You'll have full cooperation. And I have no interest in protecting anyone who violated the law, regardless of their rank or relationship to my office. Good, because we've already found some concerning patterns. Thornton opened a folder she had carried into the meeting, spreading documents across the desk between them. In the past 5 years, your department has had 467 complaints filed regarding stops and detentions. Of those, 412 were filed by black residents. That's 88% of complaints from a population that represents 34% of your city. I've seen similar numbers in the data my transition team compiled. The disposition of those complaints is equally concerning. 91% were closed as unfounded or unsubstantiated. Only 7 complaints resulted in any disciplinary action whatsoever. And of those 7, 6 involved written reprimands that had no practical effect on the officers' careers. The statistics were familiar, but hearing them recited by a federal investigator gave them different weight. These were not campaign talking points or reform proposals. They were evidence of systemic failure that had now attracted the attention of the Justice Department. What are you looking for specifically? Nadine asked. Proof that these numbers reflect policy rather than coincidence. Training records, supervision patterns, internal communications. Evidence that leadership either encouraged these practices or failed to address them despite knowing they existed. Thornton paused. We're also interested in the body cam footage issue you've encountered. Gaps in recording. Evidence that appears to have been deleted or corrupted. If that's happening systematically, it suggests deliberate destruction of evidence that could document misconduct. My internal affairs sergeant has been investigating exactly that. She's found discrepancies in multiple cases, not just mine. We've been coordinating with Sergeant Medina. Her work has been helpful. Thornton gathered her documents, returning them to the folder with the same precision she seemed to apply to everything. One more thing, Mayor Holloway. The evidence you received anonymously, the audio recording and the email. We'd like access to those materials. I've already provided copies to Sergeant Medina. Good. But I want to be clear about something. Anonymous sources can be valuable, but they can also be manipulative. Someone provided you with evidence that supports your reform agenda and implicates your political opponents. That's convenient. Perhaps too convenient. We'll verify everything independently, but you should be cautious about treating unverified materials as established fact. The warning was fair, even necessary. Nadine had considered the same possibility herself, the chance that someone was feeding her information designed to advance an agenda she could not see. But caution had limits, and some evidence was too significant to ignore, regardless of its source. I appreciate the advice. I'll keep it in mind. Do that. We'll be in touch as the investigation progresses. Thornton left, and Nadine remained at her desk, the weight of the conversation settling around her. The federal investigation would take months, possibly longer. Its conclusions would shape her city's police department for years to come. And throughout that process, she would be both participant and observer, both advocate for change and subject of scrutiny, navigating contradictions that had no easy resolution. Her phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number that had become disturbingly familiar. The email was real. Sloan is scrambling. Watch for moves against Medina. She stared at the message, then deleted it without responding. Whoever was feeding her information had their own motivations, their own agenda. She would use what they provided, but she would not trust them. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The disciplinary hearing for Officers Gentry and Whitfield convened 8 weeks after the incident, held in a conference room at police headquarters that had been configured to resemble something approximating a courtroom. A 3-member panel of senior officers presided, their authority to determine penalties limited by union contracts and civil service protections that had accumulated over decades of negotiation. Nadine did not attend in person, the conflict of interest too obvious to ignore. But she watched the proceedings through a video feed that had been established for oversight purposes. The hearing was not public under department regulations, but the mayor's office had argued successfully that the complainant was entitled to observe the process, even if she could not participate directly. Kyle Brennan represented the officers as their union advocate, his earlier confidence somewhat diminished but not eliminated. He had spent the intervening weeks building a defense that emphasized procedural compliance, the legitimacy of the initial complaint, and the difficulty of making split-second decisions in ambiguous situations. These officers responded to a call that described suspicious behavior, Brennan argued during his opening statement. They followed their training, attempted to identify the individual involved, and escalated only when that individual refused to cooperate. Every action they took was consistent with department policy and established case law. The prosecution, such as it was, came from the department's Office of Professional Standards, represented by a lieutenant who seemed uncomfortable with the assignment. His presentation was competent but cautious, avoiding the aggressive advocacy that might have been appropriate given the evidence. The record shows that Officers Gentry and Whitfield detained a citizen without reasonable articulable suspicion, threatened charges that had no factual basis, and applied restraints to someone who posed no threat and offered no resistance. These actions violated department policy and potentially state law. The hearing continued for 2 days, testimony and cross-examination establishing facts that were already well documented. The body cam footage that existed showed what it showed. The gap in recording was acknowledged but not explained. The audio recording from the anonymous source was introduced but challenged, its authenticity disputed by defense counsel, who argued that unverified evidence should not be considered. The panel deliberated for 4 hours before announcing its findings. Officer Marcus Gentry was found to have violated department policies regarding detention standards and use of restraints. He received a 30-day suspension without pay and mandatory retraining in de-escalation techniques. Officer Pamela Whitfield was found to have violated policies regarding supervision of subordinates and proper authorization of detention. She received a written reprimand and was removed from field supervision duties pending completion of additional training. Neither officer was terminated. Neither faced criminal charges. The union had successfully argued that their actions, while inappropriate, did not rise to the level of intentional misconduct that would justify more severe penalties. Nadine watched the announcement through the video feed, her expression neutral despite the frustration building behind it. This was how the system worked. This was why reform was so difficult. Officers who had violated a citizen's constitutional rights received suspensions and reprimands that would barely affect their careers, while the citizen, in this case the mayor herself, was left to wonder whether anything had really changed. Her phone rang. Rosa Medina. You watched? I watched. For what it's worth, the outcome was better than most. 30 days without pay is significant. Removal from supervision duties affects her career trajectory. These aren't nothing penalties. They're not nothing, but they're not accountability either, not real accountability. Maybe not, but they're precedent. The next case will reference this one. The case after that will reference both. Change happens slowly, one decision at a time. Medina paused. There's something else, something you need to know. What? Deputy Chief Sloan submitted his retirement paperwork this morning, effective in 14 days. He's taking accumulated leave, so today was essentially his last day in the building. Before the federal investigation could compel his testimony. That's the timing, yes. Nadine closed her eyes, processing the implications. Sloan's retirement meant he would leave with his pension intact, his record officially unblemished, his role in the cover-up never formally established. The email evidence suggested his involvement, but suggestion was not proof, and proof required processes that could no longer touch someone who had removed himself from the department's jurisdiction. Can the federal investigators still compel him to cooperate? Possibly, but it's more complicated now. He's no longer an employee subject to department discipline. His attorneys will fight any subpoena. It could take months, even years to resolve. Medina's voice carried the weariness of someone who had seen this pattern before. This is what happens, Mayor. This is how the system protects itself. People leave before they can be held accountable. Evidence disappears, memories fade, and eventually everyone moves on to the next crisis. Not this time. Nadine's voice hardened. I'm not moving on, and neither is the federal investigation. If Sloan thinks retirement protects him, he's miscalculated. I hope you're right. I really do. The call ended. Nadine sat in the quiet of her office, the evening light fading beyond the windows, the city continuing its rhythms, while decisions that would shape its future played out in conference rooms and courthouses, and the private calculations of people protecting their interests. Her phone buzzed again. The unknown number. Sloan isn't done. He's working with the union to undermine Medina's investigation. Documents are being moved. Be ready. She did not respond, but she did not delete the message either. The federal investigation's preliminary findings arrived 4 months after the team had established itself in the city. The report ran to 173 pages, dense with data analysis, case reviews, and legal conclusions that would shape the department's future for years to come. Patricia Thornton presented the findings in a press conference at the federal courthouse, her delivery measured and precise, the language careful but unambiguous. Our investigation has identified significant concerns regarding the police department's practices in several areas, she announced to a room filled with reporters, cameras, and the particular tension that accompanied moments of institutional reckoning. Specifically, we have found evidence suggesting a pattern of constitutional violations in the areas of stops and detentions, use of force, and accountability mechanisms. She outlined the key findings with the clinical precision of someone presenting evidence rather than arguing a case. Stop and detention data showed statistically significant disparities based on race. Use of force incidents were concentrated among certain officers whose supervisors had failed to intervene despite clear warning signs, and the department's internal accountability systems had repeatedly failed to address documented problems. Perhaps most concerning, Thornton continued, we have found evidence of systematic failures in evidence preservation. Bodycam footage that should have been maintained was lost, corrupted, or deleted in a significant number of cases involving complaints against officers. This pattern suggests either deliberate destruction of evidence or negligence so severe that it constitutes effective destruction. The press conference continued with questions and clarifications, but the essential message was clear. The federal government had found what Nadine had suspected since before she took office. The department's problems were not isolated incidents or individual failures. They were systemic, embedded in policies and practices and cultures that would require fundamental change to address. The recommendations that accompanied the findings included enhanced training requirements, revised use of force policies, mandatory body cam protocols with severe penalties for violations, and the establishment of an independent monitor to oversee implementation. If the city agreed to implement these changes voluntarily, the matter could be resolved through a consent decree. If not, the Justice Department reserved the right to pursue litigation that could result in court-ordered reforms. Nadine held her own press conference 2 hours later, accepting the findings and committing to voluntary compliance. The federal investigation has confirmed what many residents of this city have known for years, she said, standing at a podium flanked by the city attorney and the interim police chief who had been appointed after Sloan's departure. Our police department has failed to meet the standards our community deserves. That failure ends now. She outlined the reforms her administration would implement, many of them drawn from the proposals she had campaigned on, but had lacked the political support to enact. The federal findings provided that support, transforming optional reforms into mandatory requirements, giving her administration the leverage to make changes that would have been blocked under normal circumstances. I want to be clear about something, she continued, addressing the cameras and the broader audience they represented. Real change takes time. The problems we're addressing developed over decades. They won't be solved in weeks or months, but we are committed to this process, and we will be held accountable for our progress through the independent monitor the consent decree establishes. The questions that followed ranged from skeptical to supportive, reflecting the divided opinions that any reform effort generated. Some reporters asked whether the changes went far enough. Others questioned whether they went too far, whether necessary enforcement would suffer, whether officers would be hamstrung by excessive oversight. Nadine answered each question with the patience of someone who had expected every objection and prepared responses accordingly. After the press conference, she retreated to her office for a private moment of something that felt less like triumph than exhaustion. The battle she had sought was being won, slowly and incompletely, through processes that ground forward regardless of anyone's preferences. But victory in this form was not satisfying. It was necessary, important, meaningful, but not satisfying. Her phone rang. An unknown number, but different from the one that had been feeding her information. She answered cautiously. "Mayor Holloway, this is Patricia Thornton." "Ms. Thornton, I thought you'd be celebrating your findings." "I don't celebrate findings. I implement them." A pause. "I'm calling because there's something that didn't make it into the public report. Something you should know." "I'm listening." "The email you received about Deputy Chief Sloan. Our forensic team verified it. It's authentic. The metadata matches Sloan's account, the timestamps are consistent, and we've found corroborating evidence in the department's server logs." "So he did order the deletion." "He did, or someone with access to his account did, which amounts to the same thing for practical purposes." Thornton's voice carried the careful weight of someone delivering news that had implications beyond the immediate. "We've referred the matter to the U.S. Attorney for possible prosecution under federal obstruction statutes. I can't predict what they'll decide, but the evidence is strong." "And Sloan's retirement?" "Doesn't protect him from federal charges. It just means the department can't discipline him. The Justice Department can still prosecute if they choose to." Nadine absorbed this information, its implications rippling outward through the complicated web of accountability and consequence that the past months had created. Sloan might face prosecution, might face charges, might finally be held accountable for the cover-up he had orchestrated, or might not, depending on decisions made by prosecutors who had their own considerations and constraints. "Thank you for telling me. You deserve to know. You started this, whether you intended to or not. You should see how it ends." "Does it end? Things like this?" "Not really. They transform. They become something else. The problems don't disappear, they just change shape." A pause. "But the shape matters. The reforms we're implementing will make some things harder. Officers will think twice before detaining someone without cause. Supervisors will be held accountable for what their subordinates do. Evidence will be preserved instead of destroyed. Those changes are meaningful, even if they're not perfect. It's not enough. It's never enough. But it's more than nothing, and more than nothing is sometimes all we can achieve." The call ended. Nadine sat in the gathering darkness, the city lights beginning to glow beyond her windows, the weight of partial victory settling around her like a garment that did not quite fit. Real change is messy and incomplete. If this story has moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. 6 months passed. The consent decree was finalized, its requirements becoming the framework within which the department would operate for the foreseeable future. An independent monitor was appointed, a retired federal judge with a reputation for thoroughness and fairness. Training programs were revised. Policies were updated. The structures of accountability that should have existed all along were finally, slowly, put into place. Officers Gentry and Whitfield returned to duty after completing their suspensions and retraining. They were assigned to different precincts, separated from each other and from the Riverside Park area where their careers had nearly ended. Their records would carry the disciplinary actions for the remainder of their employment, a permanent notation that would affect promotions and assignments, and the evaluations that determine professional advancement. Kyle Brennan was promoted to regional leadership of the police union. his handling of the case apparently viewed as successful enough to warrant advancement. He continued to oppose reform measures, filing grievances and challenging policies, doing the work that union representatives did regardless of whether observers viewed it as protection or obstruction. Rosa Medina was promoted to captain, her investigation having established her reputation as someone willing to pursue accountability regardless of rank or politics. She took command of a patrol district where her philosophy of procedural integrity and community engagement could be implemented directly, not just recommended. Diana Vance sold her house on Maple Street and relocated to another state, her name forever associated with the 911 call that had initiated the most significant police reform in the city's history. She did not seek to explain or apologize beyond her single statement at the council meeting. Her silence spoke its own language. And Deputy Chief Warren Sloan faced federal charges. The indictment came 9 months after the incident, announced through a press release from the U.S. Attorney's Office that recited the allegations with bureaucratic precision. Obstruction of justice under Title 18, United States Code Section 1503. Conspiracy to destroy evidence under Section 1519. Civil rights violations under Section 242. Sloan surrendered himself at the federal courthouse on a Tuesday morning, posted bail, and immediately began the legal process that would determine whether his career ended in disgrace or exoneration. His attorneys filed motions challenging the evidence, questioning the investigation's methods, arguing prosecutorial overreach. The case would take years to resolve, moving through the federal court system with the deliberate pace that serious matters required. Nadine watched the coverage of his arrest from her office, the same office where she had received anonymous messages and reviewed damning evidence and made decisions that had shaped everything that followed. The satisfaction she had expected to feel was absent, replaced by something more complicated, something that recognized both the significance of the moment and its limitations. Sloan might be convicted, might serve time, might finally face the consequences that his position had allowed him to evade for so long. Or he might be acquitted, his attorneys finding some procedural flaw or evidentiary weakness that allowed him to escape. The outcome remained uncertain, dependent on juries and judges and the particular alchemy of trial that produced verdicts no one could reliably predict. Her phone rang. Sergeant, now Captain, Rosa Medina. You're watching? I'm watching. How does it feel? Nadine considered the question, searching for honesty in her response. It feels incomplete. It feels like the beginning of something, not the end. It feels like we've done what we could, and now we have to wait for systems we don't control to produce outcomes we can't guarantee. That's accountability, not the satisfying kind from movies, the real kind, where nothing is certain and everything takes forever. Do you think he'll be convicted? I think the evidence is strong, but I've seen strong evidence lead to acquittals before. Juries are unpredictable. Defense attorneys are creative, and people with resources find ways to escape consequences that people without resources never could. So we wait. We wait. And while we're waiting, we do the work. We implement the reforms. We train the officers. We change the culture, one decision at a time. Whether Sloan goes to prison or walks free, the department we're building will be different from the one he led. That matters, regardless of what happens to him personally. Nadine ended the call and returned her attention to the window, the city spread before her in the particular beauty of late afternoon light. She thought about the park bench where everything had started, now removed and never replaced. She thought about the woman in yoga pants who had made a phone call because someone's presence made her uncomfortable. She thought about the officers who had approached with assumptions and left with their careers permanently altered. And she thought about the work that remained, the training programs and policy revisions and community meetings and budget negotiations, the endless, grinding, unglamorous labor of institutional change that happened not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small decisions made correctly, day after day, until the weight of those decisions shifted the direction of something larger than any individual involved. Her schedule showed a community meeting in 2 hours, one of the regular forums she had established to hear directly from residents about their experiences with police. The meetings were sometimes difficult, sometimes confrontational, always informative in ways that official reports never captured. They were also exhausting, demanding emotional labor that no job description could adequately describe. She would go, she would listen, she would explain what progress had been made and acknowledge what progress remained elusive. She would do the work. The park bench reappeared 3 weeks before the first anniversary of the incident. Not the original, which had apparently been destroyed during its unexplained removal, but a replacement. Identical in design, positioned in exactly the same spot, installed without fanfare or announcement by a maintenance crew that claimed the work order had been routine. Nadine learned about it from Terrence Boyd, whose ongoing coverage of police reform had made him the city's primary chronicler of everything connected to the original incident. He called her office one morning with the news, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who had witnessed something meaningful. "I thought you should know. Someone replaced the bench." "Who authorized it?" "That's the thing. No one knows. The work order exists, but the signature is illegible, and the authorization code traces to a closed account. It just appeared. Like the removal. Like the removal." Nadine hung up and sat with the information, trying to determine what it meant and who might have been responsible. The anonymous source who had fed her evidence throughout the investigation? A supporter within city government who wanted to create a symbol? Someone with their own agenda that she could not perceive? The answer might never come. Some mysteries remained mysteries, their resolution less important than their existence. That Saturday morning, almost exactly a year after the original incident, she drove to Riverside Park and parked in the same lot where the patrol cars had gathered. The morning was similar, late spring warmth carrying the promise of approaching summer, families gathering at the playground, joggers moving along paths that wound through carefully maintained green space. She walked to the bench and sat down. The wood was new, unstained by weather, lacking the worn smoothness that years of use would eventually create. But the position was the same. The view was the same. The morning sounds were the same: children laughing and dogs barking, and birds calling from trees whose leaves had not yet reached their full summer density. She had brought a book, the same novel she had been reading a year ago, still unfinished because she had not been able to bring herself to continue it after everything that followed. She opened it to the marked page and began to read. This time no one called the police. No officers approached. No questions were asked about her right to occupy public space or her reasons for sitting quietly on a Saturday morning. Whether this meant change had occurred or simply that her face was now too well known for casual harassment, she could not determine. Perhaps it did not matter. Perhaps the absence of incident was its own kind of victory, however incomplete. She read for an hour, then closed the book and watched the park move through its Saturday rhythms. A mother pushed a stroller along the path, glancing at Nadine without apparent concern. A group of teenagers played basketball on the court near the parking lot, their shouts carrying across the grass. An elderly man walked his dog past the bench, nodding a greeting that Nadine returned. Normal. Ordinary. The kind of morning that should have been unremarkable and had instead become extraordinary through circumstances that revealed how much work remained to make normalcy accessible to everyone. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, but different from any of the numbers that had contacted her before. The story isn't over. There are others, other departments, other cities, other people who need what you've built here. When you're ready, reach out. The network is larger than you know. She stared at the message, its implications spreading outward like ripples on still water. The anonymous source had never identified themselves, never explained their motivations, never asked for anything in return for the information they had provided. Now they were suggesting something larger, something that extended beyond this city and this department and this particular fight. She did not respond. Not yet. But she saved the message, adding it to the archive she had maintained throughout the investigation, the documentation that might matter later, that might lead somewhere, that might be the beginning of something she could not yet imagine. The morning continued. The park continued. The work continued, invisible and endless and necessary. She stood, gathered her belongings, and walked back to her car. The bench remained behind her, empty now, waiting for whoever would sit there next. Perhaps someone who would be welcomed without question. Perhaps someone who would face the same scrutiny she had faced. The outcome depended on choices yet to be made, by officers not yet trained, under policies still being implemented, in a system still learning whether it wanted to change or merely wanted to appear changed. The difference between those two possibilities was everything. The work of making that difference real was the work that remained. The anniversary of the incident passed with coverage that ranged from commemorative to critical. News organizations published retrospectives analyzing what had changed and what had not. Community organizations held events celebrating the reforms while demanding more. The police union issued a statement defending officers' rights and questioning whether oversight had become oppressive. The Independent Monitor published a progress report noting significant improvements in some areas and continued concerns in others. Nadine marked the anniversary with a public statement and a private dinner with Rosa Medina, the two women who had navigated the complications of the past year together, if not always smoothly. They ate at a restaurant where the mayor's presence would not be unusual, their conversation moving between professional updates and personal reflections. 1 year, Medina said, raising her glass in something that was not quite a toast. 365 days since a Saturday morning in the park changed everything. Did it change everything? Sometimes I wonder. It changed enough. The consent decree is real. The training is real. The accountability mechanisms are real. Officers think twice now before doing things they would have done without consideration a year ago. And the ones who still do those things? Get caught more often, get disciplined more seriously, get removed from situations where they can cause harm. Medina set down her glass. It's not perfect. It's not justice in some absolute sense, but it's better. And better is what we can achieve, even when better isn't enough. Nadine nodded, accepting the assessment while recognizing its limitations. Better was meaningful. Better was worth the effort. But better was also insufficient. A reminder that the gap between aspiration and achievement was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed. What happens next? She asked. We keep working. We implement the reforms. We build the culture we want instead of the culture we inherited. We train officers who will train other officers who will eventually lead departments of their own. Medina smiled slightly. And we hope that 20 years from now, someone sitting on a park bench doesn't have to worry about whether they belong there. That's a long time. Real change is a long time. Everything else is just gesture. They finished their dinner and parted with the cordial distance of colleagues who respected each other, but would never quite be friends. Their relationship was defined by professional necessity, by the roles they occupied, by the work they shared. It was enough. It had to be. The federal trial of Warren Sloan began 15 months after his indictment, the delays accumulating through motions and continuances, and the ordinary slowness of serious criminal proceedings. The evidence presented over 3 weeks painted a picture of deliberate obstruction, of a command officer who had ordered evidence destroyed to protect subordinates who had violated constitutional rights. The defense argued alternatively that the email had been fabricated, that Sloan had not actually sent it, that even if he had sent it, his instructions had been misinterpreted, that even if they had been correctly interpreted, his actions did not rise to the level of criminal obstruction. The arguments were creative, technically proficient, and ultimately unconvincing to the jury that heard them. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon, announced in a courtroom packed with reporters and advocates and officers whose careers would be affected by the outcome regardless of which way it went. Guilty on all counts. Sloan showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. His attorneys immediately announced their intention to appeal. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 months later, with prosecutors recommending substantial prison time and defense attorneys arguing for leniency based on decades of service. Nadine watched the verdict announcement from her office, the same way she had watched so many developments in this case. The satisfaction she had expected was again absent, replaced by something more complicated, something that recognized both the significance of the moment and its limitations. A high-ranking police official had been convicted of federal crimes. That was significant. That was precedent. That was evidence that accountability could reach even those who had long considered themselves untouchable. But Sloan was one person. The system that had produced him, that had protected him, that had allowed him to rise to command while engaging in the behaviors that had now ended his career, was still intact. Changed, yes. Reformed, partially. But not transformed. Not fundamentally different in its structure or its incentives. Real transformation would take generations, not years. Would require sustained attention that was difficult to maintain when new crises demanded resources and new controversies consumed attention. Would depend on choices made by thousands of people in thousands of situations, none of them dramatic, all of them cumulative. Her phone buzzed with a familiar notification. The unknown number, silent for months, had reappeared. Well done, but the work continues. When you're ready to expand, we'll be here. She did not respond, but she did not delete the message either. The sentencing hearing came 2 months later. The courtroom was smaller this time, the crowds diminished by the interval between verdict and consequence. Sloan sat at the defense table in civilian clothes, his uniform and rank permanently behind him, his future measured in months and years of federal supervision rather than decades of pension and retirement. The judge delivered the sentence with the measured gravity that such moments required. 18 months in federal custody, 3 years of supervised release, a fine that would consume a significant portion of his accumulated savings, and, perhaps most significantly, permanent prohibition from employment in law enforcement or any position involving public trust. Sloan's attorneys announced they would appeal. The appeals process would take years, during which Sloan would remain free on bond. His sentence stayed pending resolution. The accountability that the verdict represented would not become reality until courts at every level had reviewed and affirmed the jury's decision. But the verdict stood. The sentence was imposed. The precedent was established. Nadine released a statement thanking the prosecutors and expressing hope that the outcome would deter future misconduct. Her words were measured, appropriate, the kind of response that her position required. They did not capture what she actually felt, the complicated mixture of satisfaction and frustration, and recognition that this ending was also a beginning, that the work was not finished and would never be finished in any complete sense. That evening, she drove to Riverside Park one final time. The replacement bench sat in its familiar spot, weathered now by a year of use, its new wood beginning to show the marks of people who had sat there, read there, existed there without incident or interference. She did not sit down, just stood near the bench, watching the evening light fade across the grass and water and playground, where children's laughter still echoed despite everything that had happened in this place. The park continued. The city continued. The work continued. Her phone buzzed. This time she answered. "Mayor Holloway, this is the network. We've been watching what you've built. We think it's time to expand." "Who are you?" "People who care about the same things you care about. People who have resources and connections and information that can help. People who want to see what happened here happen elsewhere." "What do you want from me?" "Nothing yet. Just awareness that we exist, that the work you've done has attracted attention from people who might be useful. When you're ready to think beyond this city, reach out. The number will work." The call ended. Nadine stood in the fading light, holding a phone that had become a conduit for communications she could not fully understand from sources she could not fully identify. The story was not over, would never be over. The park bench where it started sat waiting for whoever would sit there next, their experience determined by choices made in conference rooms and courtrooms, and the quiet moments when officers decided how to treat the people they encountered. Better was possible. Better had been achieved. But better was not enough. It would have to do for now. The bench remained. The work continued. The city changed, slowly, incompletely, in ways that were visible only to those who knew where to look and were willing to wait long enough to see them. And somewhere, in cities across the country, other benches waited for other people whose presence would be questioned for reasons that had nothing to do with their actions and everything, to do with assumptions that systems had embedded so deeply they felt like nature rather than choice. The fight was not finished. The fight was never finished. But it continued, one moment at a time, one decision at a time, one act of resistance against injustice that revealed what was possible when someone refused to accept that things could not be different. Nadine Holloway had come to a park to read a book. She had found something else entirely, something larger than herself, something that demanded more than she had expected to give. She had given it anyway. That was the story. Not triumph, not tragedy, but the complicated reality of change that happened slowly, painfully, incompletely, in a world that resisted transformation even as it desperately needed it. The park bench waited. The work continued. And somewhere, always, someone was deciding whether to sit down and see what happened next.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.